This is one of the only attempts on St. John Bosco's life in which the assassins actually drew blood, but it wasn't the Masons this time. It was a heretical group called the Waldensians, who we've already heard about in a previous episode. Their gangster methods of intimidation, threats, and violent attacks in this account sound like they could have given Al Capone a run for his money. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'm just going to briefly outline the tenets of the Waldensians so that you have a profile of the assassins in this episode. They rejected most of the 7 sacraments. The confession of sins didn't require a priest, in their opinion, and baptism wasn't administered to infants, but they waited till the person was much older. They denied the doctrine of transubstantiation, virginity of Our Lady, the notion of purgatory, and of prayers offered for the dead. The Waldensians attempted to engage Don Bosco in debate several times, as he himself said. He wrote, "In 1852, a well-known Waldensian minister came to the oratory. After introducing himself, he showed me a book saying, 'Here, the infamies of the Catholic Church are fully exposed.' It was a book by C.L. Trivier abounding in lies and calumnies. When I asked him to cite me a few of the alleged infamies, he answered, 'Isn't it an infamy for the Pope to demand worship as if he were God or even greater? Isn't it an infamy to adore saints and images? Isn't it an infamy to forbid people to read the gospel?' On hearing these wild accusations, I calmly asked him to show me any decree of either Pope, Bishop, Council, or Father of the Church wherein even a single phrase sanctioned any such abuse. After all, the burden of proof rested with him, the accuser. He turned over page after page, scanning the chapters and paragraphs, but he couldn't find what he wanted. Finally, he said, 'I'll come back with all the necessary proof and documentation.' 'Please do,' I told him, 'and take all the time you need. If you can prove what you assert, I shall believe you. Otherwise what? Otherwise, I shall have every good reason to say that Waldensians are liars.' The minister laughed. I waited for him to return, but I never saw him again." However, Don Bosco wasn't satisfied with merely confounding someone in a dispute. Pondering over the unjust methods, slanders, and iniquitous distortions of demagogues, revolutionaries, and Waldensians in their smear campaign against the teachings and the rites of the Catholic Church, he conceived new undertakings, even greater than those already launched, and whose wholesome influence would gradually amaze the world. As early as 1850, Don Bosco had planned to stem the rising tide of heretical publications with a series of popular booklets entitled Letture Catholice, Catholic Readings. The site of the headquarters of this new publication was to be in Turin. However, Don Bosco was not in a position to shoulder the burden and responsibilities of an enterprise of this magnitude all by himself. He had to find other people with similar interests in such a venture. In 1850, Don Bosco had already discussed with Bishop Luis Moreno of Ivrea this publishing venture, whose aim was to openly counteract Waldensian propaganda. Bishop Moreno now approved Don Bosco's plan enthusiastically and became his most powerful and zealous ally. The publication was very successful, and it wasn't long before 2 ruffians came to the oratory to warn Don Bosco to stop publishing Letture Catholice. They offered him 4,000 lire as a bribe and said there was more where that came from if he would only publish books they commissioned and stop Letture Catholice. Of course, Don Bosco politely but flatly refused. "Gentlemen," he said, "I get your message clearly, but let me tell you quite frankly that when truth is at stake, I fear no one. I became a priest to serve my church and save souls, particularly the souls of the young. I started Letture Catholice for this very reason, and I intend to continue this publication and do everything in my power to enhance its popularity." Well, at this point, one of them said, "You're making a terrible mistake." This thought was echoed by his friend as they both stood up. The facade of their fine manners had completely disappeared. "Yes, a terrible mistake," the minister repeated. "Your refusal is an insult. Aren't you afraid of what could happen to you? When you leave this room, can you count on returning?" These words were uttered in such threatening tones that the boys on guard outside, fearing for Don Bosco's safety, rattled the doorknob to make it perfectly clear that there were people around. In no way alarmed, Don Bosco replied, "Obviously, you gentlemen don't know Catholic priests too well. You might as well learn this now. As long as we live, we priests are happy to work for God. If we should die while carrying out our duties, we would regard such a death as our greatest fortune and glory. Spare yourselves the trouble of threatening me. Don't make yourselves look ridiculous." These courageous words so enraged the two visitors that they moved threateningly toward him. Don Bosco then grabbed his chair and added, "If I cared to use force, I would make you pay dearly, but I won't. A priest shows his strength in being patient and forgiving. You've said enough. You better go now." As he spoke, he moved toward the door and opened it, still holding the chair partly in front of him like a shield. Joseph Buzzetti was standing by. "Please show these two gentlemen to the gate," he said. "They don't know their way too well." The two men exchanged glances and then muttered, "We'll see you again." These words and their none too subtle threats during their conversation form just a single link in a long chain of vicious attempts on Don Bosco's life. Heretics and cutthroats seem to have joined together in a vast conspiracy against him. Since these attacks were so numerous and almost unfailingly well planned, we have no hesitancy in declaring that divine providence must have shielded him, and he remained mostly unscathed. The Waldensian assassins only drew blood on one occasion. It was on a quiet Sunday evening when Don Bosco was summoned to hear the confession of a woman who was deathly sick. She lived almost opposite the refugio in a house owned by a man named Sardi. In view of his previous experiences, Don Bosco prudently summoned two husky and courageous young men to accompany him. "There's no need to bring them along," said the man who had called him. "I'll escort you both ways." At these words, Don Bosco became all the more suspicious. Instead of taking two boys, he decided to take four. Two of them, Hyacinth Arnaud and James Cerruti, were so muscular and strong that they could have felled an ox. The other two were Ribaldi and Joseph Buzzetti. When they reached their destination, Don Bosco told the latter two to wait at the foot of the stairs and took Arnaud and Cerruti with him to the second floor, instructing them to wait on the landing outside the sick woman's room. When he entered, he saw a bedridden woman gasping for breath and four men sitting close to her. She acted out her role so well that it really looked as though she were about to draw her last breath. As Don Bosco asked the four men to leave the room so that he might minister in privacy to the patient, the woman interrupted him, shouting, "Before I make my confession, I want that villain over there to retract the slanderous things he has said about me." As she said this, she pointed to a man opposite her. "I won't retract a single word," he answered, standing up. "Let's not get excited," broke in another. "Shut up, you scoundrel, or I'll choke you." This exchange, interwoven with several unprintable imprecations, created a terrible din in that small room. All of them were now on their feet. In the midst of the uproar, the lamps were extinguished. Then the din suddenly ceased, and a veritable hailstorm of blows from clubs were directed at the spot where Don Bosco was standing. He immediately knew he had been tricked again. To defend himself, he grabbed the chair near the bed. He held it upside down over his head and, protected by this improvised shield, tried to get out of the room while murderous blows were crashing down noisily upon the chair. When he reached the door, he found it locked. Using his extraordinary strength, he twisted and tore the lock away with one hand, just as the two boys on guard outside were ramming into the door with their shoulders and flinging it open. Arnaud was the first to enter. He grabbed Don Bosco by the arm and pulled him outside. Don Bosco was grateful that both his head and shoulders were unharmed. However, one of the cudgels had grazed his left hand, injuring his thumb. His hand was dripping with blood, much to the concern of the oratory boys. The nail was completely ripped off, and the bone was so badly bruised that the scar was visible even 30 years later. But even still, after being attacked by 4 men with cudgels in a dark room, that's all they could do? You have to remember that Don Bosco has been shot at point blank, attacked with knives and every manner of blunt instrument, and the most his enemies can do is hurt his left thumb? That's the protection of God for sure. But anyway, to finish the story, once safely outside, Don Bosco urged his boys not to mention the incident at all to anyone, adding, "Let us forgive them and pray that they may see the light. Such poor wretches need our prayers, for they are enemies of religion." If you'd like to hear about other attempts on Don Bosco's life, just click on the playlist I put on the screen. Thank you all so much for watching. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.